Let's do it. All right. Welcome back to the podcast. We have Rio Valley Home Educators series, and we are getting started with our third episode today. Today, we have a fantastic topic. We're going to be talking about differentiation and meeting every learner's needs.
Come on in, the lesson's about to begin. Got questions, we'll let the learning sink in. From the ABCs to far off stars, you'll learn so much wherever you are. It's the Rio Valley Home Educators Learning Series, making every day bright and every lesson a breeze.
Today, we are diving deep into the topic that is crucial for every educator and parent: differentiation. How do we meet the unique learner goals that we set for our students? Well, to help us unpack this, I am thrilled to introduce our expert guest, Lisa Polk. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Ashley. I am super excited to be able to talk about this.
Awesome, Lisa. Well, let's start with the basics. For anyone who might be new to this concept, what exactly is differentiation in education?
Well, differentiation is actually tailoring instruction to meet your individual students' needs. So it is knowing that not all students learn at the same way, the same pace, the same time. And it's about finding approaches that work for your individual student. So instead of a one size fits all, this is how we're going to do it, it's about helping your student to succeed. And it's really about giving students what they need when they need it.
I love that. So giving students when they need, what they need, when they need it. So how can us as educators and the parents that we work with in the independent study and homeschool setting practically apply these differentiation strategies? So let's say elementary ELA. What might be some actionable items that a home educator or a teacher might be able to implement?
Well, some things you can do for reading. So, language arts is reading and writing. Some of the things that you can do for reading are leveled texts. A lot of the curriculum out there has different leveled texts within each grade level. So you could place your student where they're actually needed at that particular time in their curriculum learning journey. And it's maybe, focusing on small groups. So, if you were in a classroom setting, you would have, small groups that are all meeting the same type of pacing, and they're needing the same type of text. They could read one text while another group that was able to, maybe decipher bigger words reads the next level text. And it's also about, grouping students where they need with their peers so that they don't have some students that are just getting left behind while other students are just, whoosh, right over the top. Another thing you can do for writing as part of the language arts is, like a choice board. A choice board is super fun, and this is great for in classroom or at home. A choice board is you would create, a poster board, and you'd have different choices for the student to do, like draw your favorite character or write an alternative ending or a choose your own adventure type thing. Some students really like the comic strips. They could draw a comic strip after, and you'd have all of these different choices, and then they would choose one to go ahead and write about, draw about, or illustrate. So it really, it empowers the students to be able to, express themselves with their own individual learning styles.
I love the idea of the choice board and really giving the students ownership of their own learning. And as far as leveled texts are concerned, do you know anything, or are there any ways that you've heard of being able to level multiple texts for different learners? Maybe if it's not part of the curriculum?
You can go to, to the library if you know their Lexile score. You can go to the library and kind of find out what level they are, and go, the Lexile score is the reading score that they're given, and you can kind of place wherever they would be on there. And a lot of websites you can go to, if you put in their level, it'll give you different levels of readers that you have. The library is a great resource, and online too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff online, a lot of different reading books online where you can actually, the students can flip the page. If you go to YouTube, you can pick a different book
Mm-hmm.
and have them actually read it, and it can read to them. So there's a lot of different resources. If it's not part of the curriculum, you can, and ask around,
Yeah, absolutely. I think asking around is huge. And then now, like with the like prevalence of AI more, I could definitely see potentially if you had an article that you found online, putting that into an AI bot and maybe asking it to level it for your particular student's grade level, or like you said, lifestyle level to get that closer learning, reading match. They're still getting the same content. I really like that idea. Cool.
Well, and yeah, and piggybacking on your AI, another thing you can do with AI that I've done for some of my students is ask it to write a specific story about them, give details. Kids love to read about themselves. Ask AI to write a grade 2 story about a student and their sister and their brother playing with their favorite toy. And then AI will, anywhere from 3 sentences to 3 paragraphs, it'll spit it out for you. So that, also is a good way to get the different levels of reading out there.
I could imagine too going to the writing piece, using something along those lines to get new writing prompts, or like you said, adding things that your student is interested in to really draw out that choice to create some of those writing experiences that do really speak to them and give them the opportunity to write at their level.
Right. And then in the classroom, you could do it like as a classroom type story. I know we're, talking about individualizing, and it can become overwhelming when you have multiple students. So, if you were doing it at a classroom level, you could obviously tailor it to something that's going on in your classroom as well. It's a great tool once you learn how to work it and use it.
Absolutely. So, if we're switching gears a little bit for elementary school math, what might differentiation look like in a math setting?
Well, for the elementary students, manipulatives are huge. A lot of students, when they're first learning mathematical concepts, don't necessarily understand just the numbers on the black and the white paper. So, having manipulatives, counting bears, unifix cubes, base 10 blocks, they can move and physically interact with the numbers. They can place them in different areas and kind of actually see what is being taught. If you're talking about addition, you can actually physically see you have 2 red place markers and 3 red place markers. And when you put them together, you have 5 red place markers versus just numbers on a paper. And then also, tier your problems. You might have some students that are just learning the addition concept and they need single digits, while you have other students that have mastered the single digits or they get it real quick. Now they need to do double digits with regrouping. You can have different word problems where you can incorporate word problems in there where students are reading and then pulling out the actual information, trying to find out what's being asked of the word problem, and then solving the problem that way.
Those are awesome ideas. I really like the idea of starting small and building upon it, especially when we're looking at some of our students who struggle with math, right? So maybe regrouping is where we're trying to get in our second grade curriculum, but we're starting with those single digit numbers and really building their knowledge and their ability to get up to that double digit regrouping or larger regrouping through that repetitiveness and work in smaller areas.
Oh, absolutely. And there's also open-ended tasks too. So, if you do give your students, take it into the real world, why do I need to learn addition? It's kind of, students, why do I need to learn this? Why do I need to learn this? Well, if you're going to go to the grocery store, you want to make sure that you're not getting overcharged for something. Or if you're going to make a recipe and it tells you need, 3 apples for this and 3 apples for that, you want to make sure that you're knowing to add the apples to get it. So, you can, you know, give them real life experiences, especially, with math. It's so easy. We use math daily without even realizing that we're using math daily.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring that up because that's actually been kind of a theme that we've noticed here on the podcast in some of our past episodes is that idea of project-based learning and how beneficial it can be with the student buy-in. And one of the things that Whitney brought up in our last podcast, pacing, using project-based learning to help with those times when you get ahead, or if you need like a week of being able to get caught up on other things, adding in a project-based activity for math or ELA while you're getting caught up in the other subject, really kind of fold in these real life activities. So it sounds like that's something that's really important for education because we keep hearing this theme over and over again.
Yeah, I truly believe it is. I'm personally, I'm a type of person that wants to know why. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And, a lot of the students are too. That's one of the questions a lot of little kids ask. Why? Well, let's show them. Let's give them some real world experience. Show them how that what they're learning is actually going to benefit them. We're not doing it just to check off a box. We're doing it to actually help them be productive members of society.
And hopefully build that love of learning.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. Learning never stops.
So, for continuing on with the idea of differentiation and kind of moving more towards our middle school and high school students, this could be a hard group to differentiate for because there's so many things that change in middle school and high school, the dynamics for the learning and what actually needs to be learned. What might be some things that we might be able to do to differentiate for? Let's start with English or ELA for some of these middle school and high school.
Well, for language arts, English language, there are differentiated, reading assignments. So, for example, if you're teaching a novel, that everybody reads, then you may choose to have different supplemental material that goes along with it. So, for example, maybe if you're reading a novel about a historical event, you could have, some learners go off and read, a historical content, a poem, an article from back then, or, target the main characters characteristics. You can kind of break apart, you can have them all, read the same novel, but then break off and branch off into different, what are you really wanting them to focus on. Flexible pace for writing. Some students need help brainstorming, they need help getting started, while other students need help revising. They can get all their thoughts down on paper, it's just a jumble of words though, so they need help revising. So, things like providing your student with detailed rubrics. What exactly are you looking for? What do you want them to focus on? What are you looking for in their writing? And then also, peer editing. A lot of times, having peers read their paper and give different feedback from, the same type of, where they're coming from the same type of arena, if you will. They're young, they're all the same age, same group, same class. Let them, kind of peer edit and review each other's. And then obviously graphic organizers, which are really beneficial for any age. Once students start writing, is having a graphic organizer where you can put all your thoughts on paper and see exactly where you want to go and what exactly do you want to write about. You got all these ideas and you want to talk and write. And, having a graphic organizer really kind of helps students to put what's in their brain on paper so they can see it. And then also, back to the project-based learning, 5 paragraph essays, those are great. There's other ways that you can differentiate for language arts. Have them do a podcast like we're doing, have them do a slideshow presentation, have them do a visual presentation, draw it out. There's a lot of different ways that you can separate, or excuse me, differentiate for reading styles as the students get older.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot around assessment too. So like I heard the rubrics and like really looking at different ways for them to show what they know. I think we're gonna have to do a follow-up podcast. I'm gonna find a new expert to do some assessment learning with us. I think that would be a really cool thing for us to dive into with the families, and how it doesn't have to be a formal test every time to show mastery.
Absolutely, it does not. Absolutely, it does not. And slideshows, slide PowerPoint presentations. Those are great for students. They're technical. They get to incorporate graphics. They get to work and make a presentation that they're proud of, and they don't necessarily feel like they're being tested and assessed on the actual reading of whatever they've read, but in a sense, they're demonstrating their mastery. They're showing you like, here, I understand this book. Let me tell you about it. Here's a PowerPoint.
That's awesome. So again, we brought up the PBL. I love that. Especially for our older students, really letting them showcase their strengths and make those individualized choices that make sense to them. How about for math, though? What would that look like in a differentiated capacity for some of our older students? Like middle schoolers and high schoolers are not going to want to sit there with their manipulatives or, to
You
do some
never
of the things.
know.
No, true. You never know. But what might be some things that we could do to differentiate some of our older students?
For math, differentiating with your older students, you don't necessarily know where your students are coming from and what their prior knowledge is. So a lot of times when you're getting ready to start a math lesson, give them a pre-assessment and kind of see where they are. When you're getting ready to start a new unit, give them, a pre-check or a pre-test. See what you know. What are you bringing into this? What do we need to work on? What do we need to maybe not focus as much time on because you've already mastered that concept? And just like in elementary, tiered problems. Obviously the problems may become more complex as they get older, but again, solving multi-step real world problems, percents on when you go out to eat, if you're going to tip, you need to calculate, how much is the bill and then how much is the percent, doing more of the project base. Let's tie it into real life, or budgeting, have students create a budget. There's beautiful, beautiful things and curriculum that you can find online for free that will help students with budgeting and, you know, financial math things, that's a real thing, as students are getting into high school. Yes, it is important to learn the basics so that we can, complete the curriculum and move on to the next level. It's also important to know how it's going to tie into the real life. Students, why do I need to know ratios? Well, if you're trying to double a recipe when you're cooking, that's why. And they don't necessarily think about it that way. They just see these numbers on the paper and it's like, no, you're going to use that. You really are, I promise.
Yeah, and I know that you teach a financial math class. Are there anything or any strategies that you've noticed in your class specifically that have been really beneficial to some of the students when you're looking at some of these more real world type things, or like just kind of integrating some of that in general?
Oh, absolutely. I have the students in my class, we do real world project base almost every single day. They each have a budget, they have classroom jobs they earn money for, they need to pay taxes come tax time. So, they're actually seeing it in paper and understanding why I need to know adding. I need to keep 15% aside for taxes. Well, how do I calculate what is 15%? It makes it more tangible when they see why they're actually learning it, instead of just having, and there's nothing wrong with, obviously you do need some repetition to get the practice to gain the skills of doing it. I'm not saying to completely disregard any curriculum and only go real world. I think the two of them play an important part together. You learn how to do percents of a number and you practice that, 10 or 15 times with 10 or 15 different problems. And then you take it into the real world. And it's like, okay, well, now that you've learned this skill, let's apply it. And so, yeah, in my financial math class, it's really, really helpful. I notice students really grasp the concept of, oh, okay, and they don't necessarily even realize they're doing math. Like they don't quite understand, what you just did in your class with your math teacher or at home with your family, and you learned all those percents. Well, now you're doing it, but it's different context. It's benefit,
Isn't
definitely huge, beneficial to
isn't
have.
that funny how kids do that? Like you can do it. I just saw you do it in
Yeah.
this context, but then when they think about it in terms of, but I have these problems and they don't make any sense to me, but you just did that. So being able to go back and forth between the two could be super powerful.
Yeah, it definitely, even as an adult, there's things that, when I'm teaching, it's like, oh gosh, yeah, I do remember learning that. And here I do it every single day, miles, you're driving down the road and you see, 126 miles to San Francisco, and automatically, it's going to be about 2 hours, but you don't realize, like, okay, you literally just took a word problem, simplified it down, and in less than 10 seconds, it's going to take you about 2 hours to get to San Francisco.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. So, with all of these super awesome strategies, what might be some ways that Rio Valley homeschool and independent study parents and students can implement them to make it a little bit more relevant in their realm?
Oh, we have a beautiful, in my opinion, setup at our school. It is so it is so wonderful that we do have the opportunity to work one-on-one with our students, which is a huge benefit, huge. Group learning is important and you do need to be around your peers, but the individualized pacing, that is the beauty of homeschooling is, you have a curriculum and the curriculum serves the student, not the other way around. So you have a curriculum, and if your student has mastered a concept, you're going to move on. You're not going to sit and have to study that every single day for 5 days a week. If your students mastered that concept, move on to the next one. And on the flip side of that, if your student's struggling with an area, take a little bit more time with that concept, break it apart, come up with, again, go back to AI. You can type in, teach me 3 different ways to help my student learn this, and it'll give you project-based learning. It can give you, worksheets, problems, word problems. There's a ton of online. There's Khan Academy, there's Crash Course, which is wonderful. Most of these things are free, relatively no cost or very low cost. And, the beauty of, Rio Valley is we do have the opportunity to access some of these things that are not necessarily out there for everybody. There's virtual field trip students can go on. Interest-based learning, very, 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 very beautiful at our school. It's very wonderful that we can take what actually is interesting to the students and create lesson plans around it and create real world. If you have a student that's very involved in Legos and building, Legos are a wonderful educational tool. I don't care what the grade level, all kids, I love Legos. You can take those and, go with it. And, flexible grouping or lack thereof. Again, one-on-one, 2-on-1, small group, get together with a couple other homeschool families, create, small groups where students can actually do hands-on reading and math, practice reading out loud, do a choice board together, create a comic strip, create a little mini movie, where you react a book. And then again, back to, project-based learning. It's just so important to be able to have students to see what they're learning and why they're learning it and how it makes sense to them. It naturally makes them want to delve deeper into why are you learning this? And especially when they become passionate about something, they find something and they run with it. Let them.
Yeah. Adding the math in, adding the reading in, doing it all in that one thing that they love so much. Those are fantastic, and they really do highlight the differentiation and the way that it isn't just for the classroom, that it's a philosophy that can benefit any learning environment. Before we wrap up, are there any final pieces of advice or anything that you might want to impart on our listeners, especially if they might be feeling overwhelmed with the idea of differentiation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Start small. Don't take on every single curriculum. I'm going to do this with math and language arts. Just start small. Maybe start offering a choice board. Maybe that's what you're going to do for the week. Just offer them a choice board. Start small, build up to it. And, when students see that you're more invested and you're working with them, not against them, it's a lot of times students will give you more buy-in, because realistically, that's what we want as teachers, as parents, as educators. We want our students to learn and to thrive. And that's really the goal. It's a team. It's the teacher, it's the parent, it's the student, it's all 3 of us making that triangle, which is the strongest shape, with the student being focused of, the teachers want, we as teachers want your students to succeed, and you as parents obviously want them to. So, it's about meeting your students where they are. You don't want to hold them back. And at the same time, you don't want to move fast, so forward fast that they get left behind.
That's such important advice, Lisa, starting small. This has been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and sharing your differentiation expertise today.
Thank you for having me. Feel honored to be asked to be on your podcast.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to season 1, episode 3. I hope you will all continue to join us next time as we explore another vital topic in education. Until then, keep learning and keep growing.
Come on in, The lesson's about to begin. Got questions? We'll let the learning sink in. From the ABCs to far off stars, you'll learn so much wherever you are. It's the Rio Valley Home Educators Learning Series, making every day bright and every lesson a breeze.